Hello, and welcome back to another episode from the lit.happensse podcast with Adriel and Belle. I'm Belle here today. If you've stumbled across this video, it is because you are here to look at how to unpack the HSC Standard English Module A rubric entitled Language, Identity and Culture. If you want a hard copy of the resource I'm taking you through today to do your own written planning on, have a look at the links below and download a copy for yourself. And I'm going to take you through it now. Let's do it. The first thing you're going to have to do is have a look at the actual Module A rubric from NESA's prescriptions list. You can access this in the NESA document entitled English Stage 6 Prescriptions, Modules, Electives and Texts for 2019 to 2016. You can find this on the Educational Curriculum New South Wales website. There's some links above, so just to help you with some direction there. So I want you to take a look. Scroll down until you can see the Standard English HSC rubrics and you'll come across the Standard Module A Language, Identity and Culture. I want you to take a quick look at that, have a read, and I'll take you through the document in a moment. So just unpause me once you've had a read and we'll be ready to continue. And now that you've had a read of the rubric, I want you to take a look at a few of these key points on here that are really just going to help us to really, as teachers, consider what this rubric means, what it's asking students to learn about and understand, what it's asking them to do. And remember, the reason you're here watching this video is because you understand that the rubric is immensely important in senior English. It is from the rubric that the HSC examination questions come from, and it is really the ethos of how to study the text, a text from the prescribed list, under this module. Okay, so let's begin. So the first thing I want you to have a think about is, what does this rubric actually mean? What is it suggesting students might have to say or do or think or create? Now, bear in mind that the rubric document, it is written, by teachers and other members of the curriculum panel, but it's also good to consider that we can simplify. We can break this down and make it even more accessible for all of our students to engage with as well. And really, for me, when I'm teaching my students, one of the senior modules is I really try and start with the rubric. It's really important for them to understand where we're tracking, what we're going to be learning across the term, what we're going to be doing with their prescribed text, and just gives them a little bit more of a direct approach as to, well, this is how we're going to examine it, and you're going to be assessed on your ability to do this under examination conditions in the HSC essay for this particular module. So in terms of what does it mean? So a few things that stand out to me, obviously the title, Language, Identity and Culture. So that lets us know as teachers that whatever our prescribed text is, the way we need to be engaging and discussing and analyzing it will be according to these three notions here, language, identity and culture. So if we actually were to start breaking down that rubric and having a look at it, we can see that it's suggesting the idea that language and text, texts are made up of language, that language actually has the power to build our identity and shape who we are as people, and not just shape individuals, but shape entire communities. So what students will ultimately need to engage with is this idea of, when they read their prescribed text, how does their understanding of the language within the text, the way in which ideas are being communicated, are they either affirming or supporting or ignoring or even challenging notions and beliefs about people and their sense of self? The rubric also wants students to actually investigate how the textual forms and conventions within their prescribed texts are actually using certain language structures and features to communicate, not just the story or the narrative, but in addition to that, the ideas of people, of communities, of identities, the values that we associate, the values that as individuals and communities we hold dear, and the attitudes that we have that influence, inform, and impact, how we perceive ourselves and perceive our sense of identity. And so looking at that third paragraph, it's actually covering the skills, what students are going to need to do with this understanding. So once they've understood language, identity, and culture, and they've started to examine their prescribed text, then they've got to actually engage in responding activities. They're going to compose arguments, express their ideas clearly, and experiment with language, with form, and even perhaps imaginary texts that are going to help explore representations of identity and culture. So, this is essentially the goal. What representation to do with language, culture, and identity is being reflected within the prescribed text that you are studying this term? So, in terms of key topic or key takeaways, we can see that there's a sense of representation within this module. And then there's a more narrowing, I mean, not that it is narrow, there's still a lot to talk about, as I'm sure you all know when you start teaching these texts, these prescribed texts. But this idea that the lens in which the students are examining is through how language is not only representing identity and culture, but perhaps how language can also shape our own sense of identity and our own sense of culture. Another thing that you might like to do is actually break down the sentences or the key statements into what it's asking students to understand or know, versus what it's actually asking them to think or do or craft. So if I'm looking at that first paragraph, very much we're in the content of establishing what we mean by this rubric, language, identity, and culture, and then looking to the second and third paragraph in terms of, well, once students have that understanding, what are they going to do with that? How are they going to use that understanding of that first paragraph of the rubric to then apply it to their prescribed text in order for them to then develop their own, judgments, approaches, appreciations as well. And then, so lastly, I want you to consider, well, in what ways then might this rubric be reflected in the prescribed text that you're looking at? So, for example, if you're doing the Henry Lawson short story collection, then you might be looking at the representations of culture there, Australian identity. You might be looking at more particularly pioneer Australian identity. You might also be actually considering the gaps and silences of the identities that are not being represented or are not at the forefront. So if you were also doing something like the contemporary Asian Australian poets and the beautiful selection of poetry there, you would actually be looking at this Asian perspective and using that lens to form the analysis around language, identity, and culture, and looking at how the poets are discussing language, discussing bilingualism, discussing community and a sense of shared identity amongst the Asian community as well. And also, a lot of those poems have a deep sense of culture in the way that customs are representative and are shaping the identity. And what you also have with some of these poets as well is the tension between language, culture, and identity, the tension that some of them feel between being part of that Asian culture and heritage, but also part of that Australian identity. And so the tension in them trying to reconcile what that means. So students can have a look at that and consider whether it's affirming or challenging or disrupting any prevailing assumptions and beliefs that not only the poets might have or the community might have, or that the student as the reader themselves might have as well. And if you were doing something like One Night the Moon, then you're looking at, again, an Australian perspective, but one with more of an outback and an Indigenous focus, and considering the tensions with the First Nation community in that text as well, and also coming from a First Nations author. Now, let's move on to the next section. This is just encouraging a deeper breakdown of the rubric. And, this is something that you could also do with students in the classroom. So the first thing could be actually having a look at the different statements and which ones of those are the more content topic based and which of those are the more skills and responding based. The other thing that I like to do is I get students to identify the key terms within the rubric, and using other terminology to form the meta language that they will use when they're analyzing. And then another great way to approach this as well is if you do have any student samples or exemplars, or you have access to a Band 6 response, even just looking at something as simple as the introduction of that essay and having students actually identify where aspects of the rubric have been represented in that student's introduction and how the rubric is being used to lead that analysis that the student is making. So, for example, we might look at some of the key terms being language, power, individual identity, collective identity, self perception, community. And, it will be really worthwhile, to spend some class time establishing that terminology, trying to get that sense of understanding in the students, and then being able to apply them to your actual prescribed text. And it will actually help guide that analysis that needs to take place as well. Now, the last kind of part of the flowchart is once you've established your key terms with your students, and they've got a sense of the key terms and the more English concept meta language that's needed, might actually try to extend them to consider additional key terms or some synonyms or some other concepts or ideas or terms that might not be in the rubric but are still very deeply connected. Things that might actually help springboard their analysis further, like communication, connectedness, belonging, nationhood, sense of self, self-awareness, self-actualization. Just those extra added terms might actually encourage students to make a more unique interpretation of the prescribed text according to the rubric. I often try to have at least a couple going into the lesson as a way for the students to start engaging. And I'm always, brilliantly and pleasantly surprised by the list and the discussion that gets generated as well. And I find it's in these discussions and in this, engagement and thought process where students actually start thinking about them texts for themselves rather than necessarily waiting for us to suggest. There's nothing wrong with us suggesting approaches. We all need to do it and we all need to cater to our individual students, but it's a nice way of having layers or levels. So students who might be struggling or not quite engaging, we're there to support them and set them up. And then students who maybe are already on board, are engaging, we're actually giving them the next level up for them to take that approach and, deepen it and strengthen it and make it their own unique perspective. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to take you through now for this rubric is last kind of activity is just a little rubric rewrite, really good for the teacher and the students, whatever you decide to do. But often putting it in your own words, I feel demystifies, the rubric, especially for students when, you say to them, well, yes, it was written by adults and by teachers and, similar academics for you. But if you actually have the students try and rewrite or summarize or do anything at all with it, even a few statements, it really gives them that sense of ownership of the rubric and puts them with the best foot forward, I think. Now, lastly, before I start to get into the nitty-gritty of my prescribed text, I do like to offer students an opportunity to create a little bit of a rubric thesis statement, and I know that I like to create my own as well. Again, the rubric thesis statement, it doesn't have to be anything complex or fancy, as straightforward as it needs to be. That's totally fine. It's just the statement that's going to then encourage a little bit of the analysis that's going to take place. So what I like to do in the thesis statement is have some of those key terms or some of the meta language, and just create a statement out of that that's like the spirit of the module. Because I do find that it helps to have this spirit of the module statement, and then once the analysis is taking place, and students are starting to create their own approaches, they can actually use the rubric thesis statement and make some adjustments on that for a more text-based one. Or even if they're practicing with past questions, have a look at how that rubric statement might connect with the question, and might even need to shape or be reimagined in a way to actually answer the specific of the question at hand. So something like this could just be something as simple as the first phrase with language is powerful because it, and having the opportunity for students to finish that off on their own. And this doesn't have to be an individual, can be pair, can be group, can be whole class. Could be even the whole class coming up with 3 of them together and then almost using them as like a guiding statement as they get through their analysis. Even something like the last point of the first paragraph of the rubric, to do with the affirming, ignoring, revealing, challenging prevailing assumptions and beliefs. So that could be a sentence stem like, language has the power to challenge or disrupt prevailing assumptions and beliefs that we have about, and finish that off. So again, doesn't have to be anything really fancy, doesn't have to be anything that's kind of essay or thesis statement ready, but it is a good starting point, not only to help consolidate the actual rubric that you've broken down with your students, but also to consolidate, well, where you move forward with that, how the rubric statement might be encouraging some of the analysis, certainly not all, but how it's going to encourage, some sort of analysis, and how it might actually have an impact on students thinking about possible approaches and possible, theses to what might be a HSC or essay style question for that module A and for their text as well. Okay, so there you have it, a bit of a guided breakdown in terms of how to actually unpack and some ways to approach the rubric and approach the key ideas and terms and just generate some student connection to what it is they're about to study. And it will certainly set them up nicely for you to be able to introduce the prescribed text or make some connections back to, the text if you may have already started it. Okay, so I hope that's been really helpful for you. If you have enjoyed it, check back to see some more videos, some more support. If you have suggestions on things that you would like us to support you with at the Lit Happens podcast, then please comment. And don't forget to listen to our weekly pod episodes. We're the Lit Happens Senior English podcast. Good luck, everyone. Enjoy. Take care.